This session actually quite special, bring all the experts from the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. And in short, we call it GPS, so Global Policy and Strategy. And Caroline, the Dean of GPS, was here yesterday with our speaker, Tom Derry. Wonderful session, just so you know, and it kicked off so strong and timely. So this is kind of a perfect setting, for the second day discussion. So what we hope to cover today is provide some critical insight into supply chain development across China, Mexico, and India, with each country presenting distinctive advantages and risks. The conversation will focus on how companies can build resilience and strategic adaptability, especially in the light of the current situation, with the tariff, U.S. policy change under the second Trump administration. So it will mean to be an interactive panel. So we will talk a little bit and then we start taking questions. So the first thing I would like to do is, because each of you represent your expertise area and the region that you focus. So I would like to just go around this panel and please spend some time talking, introduce yourself as well as the area of expertise and what you're excited to talk about today. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for having us here. I'm Gaurav Khanna. I'm an associate professor of economics at GPS. A lot of my research is on issues related to supply chains, actually. So supply chain resilience, climate change in supply chains, transportation infrastructure and supply chains, and a lot of that focuses on India, but also more globally, more widespread and globally. And on migration and supply chains, actually. So how offshoring and multinational companies and migration and that whole nexus of supply chains. Excited to talk about kind of the risks that India faces, but also the lessons more globally in this context, the advantages that India kind of also proposes in this context, and the implications more broadly around the world. So yeah.
Great.
Yeah, that's still on, right?
Yeah.
Hi, so my name is Barry Naughton. I'm an expert on the Chinese economy. I've been working on it for more than 40 years now. It's kind of incredible. We got that economy going, huh? And so obviously in the supply chain context, just to fire the first shot, obviously China has enormous cost and efficiency and quality advantages. And as of right now, we have 104.3% tariffs in the United States for everything. That's the trade-weighted tariff rate right now. And China, in response, has a trade-weighted tariff rate on U.S. products of 106%, 106.6%. So, right now the two largest economies and the two largest trading countries in the world are staring at each other with over 100% tariffs. So, needless to say, that creates a lot of uncertainty for supply chains.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Helen, for having me again this year. I'm Rafael Fernández de Castro. I teach at GPS. I teach Latin American politics and Latin American relations with the U.S., and I direct the Center for U.S Mexican Studies. So you can tell that I'm very busy these last days, and my center is, because everybody wants to understand what's going on with Trump and the U.S. And so my take is that I believe that not only Mexicans, but the world is interested and surprised by how Claudia Sheinbaum, the first woman president in Mexico, has dealt with Trump. She has shown a lot of gravitas. My argument here is that that hasn't been enough for Mexico to dodge the tariffs bullet. There's pain in the Mexican economy, and I will explain you that. And I believe that what is at stake really is the value chain, the automobile value chain in North America. That is the center of the U.S.-Mexico negotiation now. The Mexican foreign minister is basically camping in Washington. Not foreign minister, the Mexican trade minister, the economic minister is camping in Washington because it's all about getting out of the tariffs. If that persists, I believe will be done with North America as an economic community.
I'm going to ask for a tough question to begin with. How do you see your region interacting with other two? So, Rafael, keep that microphone. Are they rivals, partners, or something in between?
Well, I will say China is the big issue in Mexico and in U.S. Mexican relations. In the last 4 years, there's been a lot of Chinese investment in Mexico, and it's very visible because, for example, Chinese electric vehicles have been just very hot in the Mexican market. Why? Because they're good, because they're inexpensive, and apparently they're fairly reliable. And so now there's a big talk about what to do with China, and the world is, I will say the Mexican business community, Helen, is divided. I will say that steel people and aluminum, they just want, they don't want to do anything with China and say we shouldn't really close the border with China to Chinese products and put very big tariffs to them. The auto industry, is not content with it because they need a lot of electronics from China, from Asia. So they believe that Europe is cutting a deal with China, that Europe is coming closer to China, and they know that they will face a lot of competition out of the auto industry in Europe. So there's resistance in Mexico to just cut ties with China. So this is very complicated, I would say, and India is not very much in the picture, to be honest.
Yeah, very much agree that the relation between China and Mexico is certainly not as competitors for supply chains. It's much more complex. And I think the way to think about it is that companies, including American companies, Mexican companies, but also Chinese companies, have taken the first steps of reorienting their supply chains by channeling them through especially Vietnam and Mexico, as you all know. And in some ways, some of the Trump actions are specifically designed to disrupt this restructuring, right? Where people in a simpler world thought that they could reduce their direct reliance on China, de-risk by spreading activities. And the Trump administration is basically saying, no, that's not going to work. We're not going to allow that. So I think this is a big unresolved question. The other thing I want to just put on the table really quickly, because it was implicit already in Rafael's comments, is we're no longer just talking about American supply chains. These are also Chinese supply chains. So we've got very significant and rapidly growing Chinese supply chains in, of course, electric vehicles, solar panels, probably emerging cell phones, especially to bring in India, where this is the future, is a bifurcated global trading system where there are U.S. networks and Chinese networks, and others are in between and have to pick sides to a certain extent, but not completely.
Sorry, Barry, can you also comment the relationship between China and India?
Well, I think Gaurav is going to be better placed for that because it's so complex and so multi-stranded.
Yeah, I guess I can say something about that. My short take on the China-India relationship is that we're strategic rivals, but India has a lot of economic dependence on China. So, political rivals. So we fought wars with China. There are border disputes with China. We're both trying to be the boss of the region when clearly China is the boss, but India thinks, they can be the boss. And so there's the political tussle, the strategic rivalry. But Indian supply chains depend on inputs from China. So, electronics, machinery, right? And those are important inputs into Indian manufacturing that So India is dependent on that kind of relationship with China, even though strategically they are, vying for political influence. Now with Mexico, of course, I think it is an interesting relationship. I think there is room more for collaboration because at least there's no political rivalry, right? And there's like room for more, say, South-South collaboration. When the 2018 trade war happened, I think India was hoping to capture more of the U.S. market, which I think Mexico kind of did better than India. And so there was a little bit of, they beat us to that. But I think there's still a lot of room for India-Mexico collaboration in that front at least. Yeah.
Speaking of that, sometimes case study really helps us to understand. Do you have a case study or real-world examples of recent shift in your region's role in the global supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, I just mentioned that the 2018 trade war, the first kind of Trump U.S.-China trade war, right? So there, India said we're gonna now swoop in and kind of help realign the supply chains to go via India. So in certain industries, they were successful. So chemicals and some parts of machineries and electronics a little bit. But there was kind of Mexico and Vietnam, I think, benefited the most in some ways from that trade war. But a real world example, I think, would be the iPhone. So the iPhone, I'm sure you all have been following, but Apple has shifted a lot of production of the iPhone to India, starting with the iPhone 14, but then the 16 Pro, which is the high-end iPhone. So it's not just kind of a cheaper version, but the high-end iPhone. And it's, kind of between 2023 and 24, they doubled kind of the size of, revenue generated from India. And seeing that now Samsung has entered. So Samsung has opened a big factory in India. And this was all in response, I think, to the first trade war, essentially. In 2018 is when all of this started happening. So I think these trade wars do really realign things.
Yeah, let me sort of springboard off that because obviously Apple is such an important case. I'm sure there are people in the room who know more about the Apple supply chain than we do. But still, it's something we all follow. Obviously, Apple is a paradigmatic example of a tightly architected supply chain, right, where they're really, closely managing every bit of it, and they've done all these precautionary things, and they're still caught out, right? They're still in a really difficult situation right now. They can react more quickly, but they're all in a sense, on China. So it sort of cuts both ways. The other kind of, not exactly an example, but the alternative situation I want to raise is there are also lots of supply chains where China plays a huge role that are not tightly architected. They're very loose, sort of spot markets. But China is so big and so important. There's an ongoing study by CP, this French Economic Research Institute, finds China has a dominant position, meaning over 50% of total exports, in 730 out of 5,000 total products in the world. Which mean, and these are, some are electronics, but some are garments, some are machinery, ordinary machinery inputs, so that this problem of restructuring, supply chains, boy, it extends into so many different areas that we don't even know about. Everybody knows about Apple, but there are all these, machinery and garments and other supply chains where to be honest, we have no idea what's going to happen. And this is probably, I would guess, this is the biggest impact on the U.S. is going to be the doubling of costs of these kind of generic Chinese inputs plus strategic materials.
Hey Barry, just a quick follow-up. When you mentioned about loose, supply chain, can you give us an example, an industry or product or something?
Well, certainly garments. China, of course, has moved out of a lot of garment industry, but it has surprising dominance of lots of upstream fabrics and things like that. I realize this is probably a pretty high-tech group, and garments are not, super sexy in terms of the technologies, but, like other sectors, they are being transformed by AI and robotization. So I think it's crucial.
Mexico was, along with Vietnam, as Gaurav said, the countries who most benefited from the U.S.-China trade war. Not so much in reshoring or in nearshoring, but mostly about trade, because Mexico got out of about 2 points out of those 7 that China lost in the U.S. market. So that's why Mexico is now, and has been for the last 2.5 years, the number 1 U.S. trading partner. Central to that is the USMCA, and that's what is at stake now. We have a revision next year. Who knows what it means? This is the first time, because NAFTA didn't have anything like that. So Mexico is fully prepared for overall negotiation. Who knows what will happen? The important value chains in North America is basically the auto industry and also the airplane industry. There's a lot going on there, and so these are critical days for North America. And I will say that Mexico is not helping itself a lot because, now Claudia Sheinbaum, the new president, she has been in office only for 5 months now. And she has surprised everybody because she's leftist, but she's pragmatical, and but she has a shadow of former President Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And the big shadow that he left into her is that we're going into this judicial reform. In June 1st, we're going to elect like 5,000 judges. And in the next 3 years, we're going to elect about 11,000 people in the judiciary branch in Mexico. Everyone's going to be elected. It's going to be a mess. Yes, Mexico's judicial system was very messy, very corrupt, but what is coming is even worse. So that's a big shadow, because what Mexico needs to have more reshoring is rule of law, and that's jeopardized. We'll see what Claudia Sheinbaum has to offer, but so far she's a leftist, that she's been very kind and close to the Mexican private sector. Why is that? Because he knows that recession is coming, and she needs investment. So day in and day out, there's announcements in Mexico about this investment here, this investment there. Not much is happening. These are difficult times, and I believe recession is around the corner. This is going to be a fascinating period for her to show her leadership. It is fascinating. She has, I was seeing the polls this weekend, she's 83% job approval. It's amazing.
Just quick follow-up questions, Rafael. I think if company is considering going to Mexico as one of the alternative, given whatever, who knows, right? Time is going to tell, where the supply chain is really going to go. But I wanted to ask each of you, if company are considering going to Mexico, do investment and shifting their supply chain, what are some of the top risks that you want them to be aware? I mean, I think the political stability, maybe new government is one thing. I mean, is there something else on top of your mind?
I will say, I will advise them come to Mexico. I'll be very positive. Why I'm saying that? I believe the big problem in Mexico was under López Obrador, energy. That's changing. Claudia Sheinbaum being PhD in environmental engineering, she knows very well that. I mean, she understands climate change. So she's going back to renewables. So you'll see a modernization again in the Mexican energy industry. The industry is, I would say, very positive with her. So that means a lot. I already told you that there's a problem with the rule of law. I would say there's a lot of Mexican talent. We graduated almost as most engineers every year as the U.S. And you see a lot of U.S. firms hiring literally hundreds, if not thousands, of Mexican engineers. And so that's, I believe that's is very positive. And in the end, this is something I want to share with you. It's amazing how many foreigners, especially Americans, are living now in Mexico. Not only in Mexico City, but in many places. Why is that? because I believe because of the Mexican culture, because affordability, because people live happy lives there, and it shows up. So it's so I would bet for Mexico. I believe that I'm fairly optimistic. I believe that I hope Sheinbaum will continue to manage Trump. Who knows? But it's amazing her gravitas. I believe he was very well trained. Her boss and mentor, López Obrador, was very similar to Trump, but on the left. So she's very well trained. I'll stop here.
How about Gaurav? You take the same question about India. If companies are thinking about moving as a next best option, what would you advise the company in terms of risk and opportunity?
Well, in terms of risks, I think India does have a somewhat unique set of risks. That's kind of what a lot of my research is about. So first is enforcement of contracts is a risk that the Indian policymakers are trying to fix, essentially, right? Reneging on contracts, court enforcement. So there's a lot of court congestion, backlog in trying to actually make that happen. As a result of that, actually, there's a lot of what we call relational contracts. You essentially build relationships with CEOs and managers that you could say, oh yeah, do I trust you now? That's very different from how businesses function in other parts of the world. You're no longer kind of in a contract with a business. It's a relationship with a person that you know, right? And so that kind of skews things in certain ways. The second kind of thing is infrastructure. The ports haven't been modernized in a long time. There was a shift to, say, containerized shipping. You needed totally different types of ports, much larger ones. India's kind of been lacking and things like that. The road infrastructure is old. A lot of the transportation, a lot of the goods traffic is through trucking. That's also kind of dated in a way. The energy sector, like Rafael mentioned, the energy sector has frequent blackouts. There's so in terms of infrastructure, I think that's another kind of major thing that they need to kind of do a lot more on. And then the risks are in some ways unique in that I think that things like, for instance, climate risk, I think India is going to be pretty badly hit. And based on a lot of projections that climate scientists have been doing in terms of flooding, extreme weather events, extreme heat, India is going to have a fair amount of those kinds of risks that will emerge in the near future. And then there's the kind of the policy risk, right? So India is a federal system. The federal government, the central government kind of makes a lot of policies. Sometimes it's seen as arbitrary. So, the COVID lockdowns were very strict. India had one of the biggest falls in GDP per capita during COVID, partly because of very strict lockdowns. But each state has their own other policies. They're trying to manage supply chains, court congestion, things like that. Labor laws are complex. Land acquisition is difficult. So there is a lot of those kinds of risks. No, so the upside. So let me come to the upside. I think the biggest upside is the cost advantage. It's still a lot cheaper. The Chinese wages are 4.85 times higher than the Indian wage, right? And so that's a huge upside. It's cost effective. Now, the other thing is, even though India doesn't do great on scaling in manufacturing, in the sense that the companies are small, but there's a big, in terms of the demand side and the consumer demand side, scale is really big in the sense that incomes are rising, and so consumer demand is rising, and companies want to nearshore. They want to produce locally as a result of all of this, right? And that has the other upside is political advantages, right? So India has good political ties with most countries in the world. They're not fighting with the U.S. They're not fighting with the EU. They have a Quad with Japan. So more so than a lot of the other countries that are competitors. So politically, strategically, they are well placed in that way. And then there is the service sector, which shows kind of in many ways kind of the skill of a lot of the high tech workforce, right? The IT workforce, the STEM workforce, right? And this reflects in some ways some fundamental advantages, like the English language, for instance. Comfort with that helps contracting, helps trade and service exports, for instance. The STEM workforce reflects things like advantages in engineering and things that have been fundamental. And the diaspora that Indians have had, like, you see in the U.S. economy, for instance, your CEOs of Microsoft and Adobe and Google and all that, and very senior people in many U.S. companies. That's what those linkages are really important. That's how kind of multinationals open up in India. That's how a lot of offshoring happens, but a lot of the complex supply chains arise out of those. So there are a lot of advantages on the cost side and the skilled workforce side as well, but we shouldn't forget the risks that are there.
Yeah, Barry, I guess whatever is going on right now, there are companies thinking about maybe shifting away from China, but also entering into China.
Let's pay attention to what's happening right now, right? Trump just paused all the reciprocal tariffs for 90 days, except for China. So when we think of these risks, I mean, they are far more concentrated on China than anybody else. It could, but since the S&P just went up 8%, I don't think they're going to change it this time. So as we said at the beginning, China still has lots of economic advantages, so all of the risk is political risk. There's a view in Washington that because the Chinese economy is weak right now, they're going to make concessions. And I think that view is wrong. It is true that the Chinese economy is weak in certain ways, but if we're going to put this in the simplest possible terms, the reason that the Chinese economy is weak is because the Chinese government is over-investing in high-tech manufacturing and not resolving a housing collapse that is doing really damaging things to consumer sentiment. And so their policy is definitely misguided. They're over-investing in the wrong things. But the implication of that is that they're pretty prepared for a major shock emanating from the United States, that they have done things to insulate their economy over the last 8 years that have had some effect. Not to say they're not going to be harmed. They certainly are going to be harmed. But it's not so black and white that the U.S. is in a strong economic position and China is in a weak position. And I've heard that in Washington several times in the last couple of weeks. So there's a real danger of U.S. sort of miscalculation based on that. I would say the crucial thing to try and analyze the risks is just to recognize that the situation in China and the risks in China and the cost-benefit calculations are in many respects simply the opposite of what they are in the United States. Of course, the political system is very opposite, right? So,
was very opposite.
What?
Was.
No comment on that one. So just in terms of the politics, I mean, Xi Jinping is probably not going to back down. He is paying costs for sure, but the crucial thing is to recognize that he's also in the position to say, well, I warned you a decade ago that the Americans were going to come down on us, and now they are, so close ranks behind me even though it costs, right? And that's an argument that's going to play with certainly a significant chunk of the Chinese population. Economically, the damage is also the reverse, right? China doesn't have enough demand, and they're overly dependent upon exports. So those exports are going to be hit, and so they're going to be hurt, but it's that kind of hurt. It's recessionary hurt. The United States is the opposite, right? We're not that dependent on exports. we've got plenty of demand, and now we're going to have extra costs working into the system. So it's going to be either inflationary or stagflationary, depending upon how the macro plays out. So the economic impacts are also mirror image opposites. And whether these two sides can, wow, talk about two prideful individuals facing each other over an economic gulf. It's really hard to figure out what's going to happen, but I don't think it's going to be just a step back by China. I don't think that's going to happen.
Hi, Oceanside Perspective community. Here we are today with the Oceanside Perspective founder and CEO, Helen Wang. Helen, can you tell us a little bit about OP for the viewers that are new or who may not even know what OP is about?
Yeah, so Oceanside Perspective, I would say, well, first of all, we are content creator for the purpose of education. And we are a nonprofit, so we really care about our mission and impact. What is our mission? We have a tagline called Light Beyond Generation. So hopefully that people who are really interested to learn more about the leadership, innovation, technology, and entrepreneurship, which is a short light, across generations.
There are a lot of high-tech inputs that still comes from the United States, either directly or embedded in chips from Taiwan and things like that. But we've already been restricting that supply, so that as a sort of direct bargaining chip is probably a little bit less important than it used to be, than it would be. And they have the inputs of capital goods and components into the Chinese economy as a share of their GDP has declined a little over 1% of GDP over the last 8 years. So they're hunkering down. They've moved to a certain extent towards a fortress economy, and that means that what you're saying is absolutely right.
Sorry, I want to pull on a thread that's being discussed now. If you read research and reports, as far as the bilateral relationship, economic relationship between China and the United States, those two alone, China supposedly has a lot more leverage to make up for, if not the majority, a significant part of the trade deficit that's going to incur if this trade war continues, i.e. they can go other places and sell products, right? So are they going to use that, and is that effective? Two, they're pushing all their new contracts and negotiations to be denominated by the yuan. How's that going to impact it? And three, which is in many economists' views, is the nuclear bomb that China can use, which is dump all the U.S. treasuries at a loss and spin the U.S. treasuries completely out of control, devaluate the U.S. treasuries globally. They're a major holder. They're not the biggest holder in the world, but they are a major holder. So devaluation of the treasuries, the yuan denomination, and trade routes that does not include the United States, at least in the capacity it does right now.
So those are all true things, right? And the other sort of nuclear option is American subsidiaries in China sell $600 billion worth of revenue every year, right? I mean, we have in China, yeah, U.S. subsidiaries in China.
It's true, yeah.
Right, so that's a lot of money. So that doesn't get included in any of the calculations of trade surpluses and deficits. Now, you could argue that China's been sort of squeezing that down, certainly in high-tech sectors. As we embargo them, they also try to cut American components out of their systems. So they've been squeezing that, and certainly American automakers are much worse positioned in China than they were 5 or 6 years ago. But they've still been pretty careful to treat the American firms in China, okay. They could start to get much tougher on those firms.
By the way, yesterday they announced, they don't call it the blacklist, they call it the
unreliable entities.
They started
Yeah.
using unreliable list, and they just targeted one of the majors in China.
DuPont or somebody. Yeah. So definitely, China has these weapons, but as you say, they're dangerous. They're nuclear options. Now you can argue that we've already triggered a nuclear option. So it's a very dangerous situation, I think. Definitely China has a lot of things.
So question to all three of you. So all that we have seen in the last few days, how much of that do you think is a strategic thinking on the administration part? Maybe that answers it. Right? That, hey, let's shift the supply chains, let's bring jobs back here. Those investments will take years to happen, right? CFOs, CEOs don't make decisions within days. Versus really a political move to say, hey, we took a hard stance, we negotiated with all these countries, we got some good deals, let's win some points, throw them on the wall, and hey, we are making America great again. And that's what the administration can go back to their voters with.
Let me give my opinion. Obviously, this is something lots of people are thinking about. We're trying to figure this out. There's no good answer. I guess I'm so impressed at Trump's ability to shoot from the hip and say things, and God, he's good at that, But look at the way these tariffs were rolled out. They just didn't make sense, right? And so, incredibly, Trump has been calling for tariffs for 40 years, and he never once has thought through what that actually means and how to do it. And you have all these other people in the administration who were given, 3 weeks to prepare a plan, which they bungled. They probably had some intern do it at USTR. I mean, it's just shocking. So I think we have to say they didn't think it through as a coherent medium-term strategy. And so, really everybody's just been waiting. When is he going to flinch? And he just did, right? 20 minutes ago, he flinched. So I think you can argue that their objectives are coherent. I don't agree with them, but, as a set of objectives, you can argue that they're coherent, but you cannot argue that their strategy for achieving it is coherent. It's just not, in my view.
Others?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. The USTR formula that they use, as a trade economist, it doesn't make sense to us. Now, as a trade economist, I don't think that the optimal tariff on everything should be zero. There are probably certain things that you might want to put a tariff on, and there might be reasons to protect certain industries. But a blanket tariff to a trade economist makes no sense, right? And so for us, what was most surprising was that it's not based on certain, you're not saying I'm going to protect only certain products, certain industries, certain workers, right? So the blanket tariff sounds more like a political kind of move in some ways. And in some ways, I think it could be a successful political move, right? Like the unions came out in support of it. That's, a fairly, so we just have to see how it plays out and how they spin the overall long run thing. But they do get a sense that, like Barry said, they did flinch. So they have a sense that economically this would be costly, but at least he's saying, okay, I'm going to try to cut a deal and get the best for the country. So.
Can I just inject very quickly? When you say blanket, in my view, I could be wrong, but I think there is always a blanket when it comes to tariff. So you see that he actually has the numbers on one side and numbers on the other side. So there's always a blanket, but it's just he's trying to change to create a new blanket. And I think eventually, hopefully, it will become like a new blanket, not everything equal. Do you see that coming?
It could be right now. With the pause, let's see how it plays out. Now, of course, a lot of products then do get there's bilateral negotiations on certain products here and there that then get excluded. Like it's happening right now. Even there's like a list of excluded products, but usually, from an academic economist point of view, at least, it doesn't make sense to have widespread tariffs, right? Like, it makes sense. All the justifications for tariffs would depend on saying that, okay, there's a certain industry or a certain product that I'm trying to protect, and that's the way I'm just going to target the tariffs there. Yeah.
So, with all due respect for my brilliant colleague, who's a wonderful trade economist, and of course everything he says about trade is true, but taxes suck, and but we have to have them, and I think we're going to have 10% tariffs forever. On everything. That's one thing they're not going to go back on, and it's not going to matter that much. You can put a 10% tariff on things. That's not the end of the world. What's the end of the world is trying to negotiate a bilateral structure of balanced trade with every country. That will be a disaster. 10% tariff, we can live with it.
What do we think about 2030?
What do I think about 2030? I believe we're entering in a much uncertain world. The governance, I believe that, we're seeing the end of Pax Americana, and we're seeing this is a good moment for the strong men, so that's. I believe that and we're entering in a sort of bipolar world again. China, the U.S., we're multipolar because there's countries like India, like Brazil, that they don't align with the two hegemons, and so that's one way to see it. That worries me because the U.S. Mexico border has become really a mirror of the well-being of the world. When there's problems anywhere else in the world, like in Ukraine, immediately there's Ukrainians showing up in the border, and there's no people coming up with that. So I see that, and there's quite a few Mexicans, I would say, now that I don't know how the Mexican stock exchange is doing right now, but I would say there's a lot of people betting that the stronger the rivalry between China and the U.S. will become, Mexico will benefit the most. I don't think so. I believe that that is a war that is affecting us all, and I don't think that the U.S. There's not a plan in Washington. They don't really. There's not an end game there, so I'm pessimistic about 2030.
I'm also kind of pessimistic, and of course there's a lot of uncertainty, but let's go out on a limb and say I think we're evolving towards a bifurcated system. China is stronger with most developing countries, especially Southeast Asia, pretty strong in Latin America, say nothing of Africa. So a China-centric trading system is growing and is going to continue to grow even without the U.S. Now, it might shrink aggregate because the U.S. piece declines, and so in aggregate it might be smaller in worst case. But I think that non-U.S. system is going to continue to develop. The U.S. is, remember, stronger in relation to the developed economies than it was 10 or 15 years ago. The U.S. is a bigger share of OECD economies than it was because Japan and EU are both growing very, very slowly. And so in some ways, Trump is saying, now let's use this stronger position we have within our pole. And so I think those forces, what we don't know is how destructive this is going to be. But those forces, as you say, they began in the teens, and I think they are going to continue. So I think the trend is toward bipolarity, and the uncertainty is in how big an efficiency hit the global economy is going to take as it unravels in this way.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. Let me try to answer it not so much on the political economy side, but on the what it means for supply chain side, right? So of course, the rise of these complex supply chains have brought us huge efficiency gains, right? Like we find the best suppliers with the cheapest suppliers to produce our products, and you see that actually has been, in many ways, like a big boost to global production, right? But it also brought risks. So you have a port that shuts down because of COVID lockdowns, and suddenly we can't get chips to make our cars or washing machines. And suddenly now people realize that these risks are real. The risks are pandemic lockdowns, conflicts in Ukraine, geopolitical risks, other kinds of wars, right? Trade wars. And I think essentially what we at least see in our data is that supply chains have now started diversifying. And diversification of chains has pretty big impacts on production, right? So you're hedging, which means you're going to buy from some low-cost suppliers. You're also going to buy from some high-cost suppliers, because that high-cost supply might be safer. The low-cost supply might be riskier, right? So you need to diversify that chain. So it's no longer, there's a trade-off between that efficiency gain and the risk mitigation. So and you're seeing that more and more. And I think that given the rise in risks, the pandemics and the trade wars and the conflicts, that you're going to see more of these, more of this diversification happening, because you don't want the shocks to propagate through the whole chain, right? And that means we give up some of these efficiency gains. And maybe that's okay when you think about overall kind of reducing risk mitigation, right? I think that's kind of in 2030, you'll see more diversified chains, not as efficient in some ways, but less riskier is what I think we'll see.
So we've seen in different countries where local regulations have either incentivized investment and movement of supply chain operations into a country or made it more difficult. Do any of you on the panel see the countries which you're sort of specialized in recognizing or thinking of this current trade environment as an inflection point that creates an opportunity for them to review their policies, whether to create incentives or to use other regulations to incentivize investment in their countries?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's what the game that many countries are trying to play right now. I mean, India, when the IT boom happened, right? So the IT boom kind of was concentrated, the US, and then you had like Ireland, Israel, and India. So why India? India essentially initially said, hey, send us some work, when the Y2K crisis was happening. We'll do the low-level coding for you. And now you see we did it well. Now send us more and more work, right? And so then the tech boom takes off in India, right? And India becomes the largest exporter of IT products. So something that the US had for many, many decades been. In 2005, India overtakes the US and doesn't look back, right? Because production shifts to India. So that's the kind of thing. So India realizes then that their global advantage is in the STEM workforce. So now what they've been doing is these knowledge capability centers. What is that? You tell a multinational company, you set up, and we'll basically provide you a high skill workforce. So telling the big multinationals, you set up over here, we'll provide you the STEM workforce, we'll do the production. Now, in many ways, that's a good thing for India's GDP. The production takes place within Indian borders, right? And so this is the game they're trying to now kind of play. They realize that they're not good at manufacturing. They've missed the whole manufacturing revolution. They never excelled at the low-skill manufacturing, which is what their comparative advantage was, and so they never climbed the ladder to high-skill manufacturing. Well, let's then say that we are going to be great at providing you high-tech services, and we provide the STEM workforce for that. So come set up your companies here and do the production here, and that's the kind of investment that they're trying to attract at this time.
And even China, I mean, we talked about the way they treat American business as a potential nuclear option. But there's a flip side, right, which is that they want to make nice and attract more investment and strengthen their economy. And more fundamentally, I think in the China case, we'd shifted more from sort of regulation and industrial parks, things like that. China already does pretty well. But it's their macro policy that's terrible right now. But this is pushing them towards a different kind of macro policy, much more expansionary domestically. And if they're really wise, they would recognize they need to import more, not from the United States, but from other countries, which also demands a more expansionary domestic policy. So you can imagine, I'm not predicting it, but a possible set of events is that China takes advantage of this crisis to just ease up domestically, expand demand, expand consumption, and expand imports. If they're that smart, then they can do well.
I could see a very rosy scenario for Mexico. Yes, now this huge friction between China and the U.S., we will see in Mexico as an opportunity of reshoring. And I will say this might help Claudia Sheinbaum to lessen the judicial reform and then come up with these are very difficult times in the world affairs, and if we want to see opportunities out there, so hopefully that would really allow her to say, let's stop with the stupidity and let's not go ahead, at least with this huge judicial reform. That will be a way of Mexico. The big lesson of the last 4 years in reshoring is this is at the subnational governments. It's not really at the state government, at the federal government. The federal government is about energy, is about rule of law, but I would say, and the big lesson might be by the state of Nuevo León, which is bordering Texas. They have basically monopolized more than 50% of every reshoring into Mexico. And what Nuevo León does well, it's basically they have this ecosystem there. They have everything there. They have universities, they have talent, they have a lot of businesses there. So there's this the entire ecosystem.
Service, including service sector. The last 10 years or so, there has been a movement towards nationalistic policies in government, not just the US, India, China, Asia, European countries, Latin American countries. So as you look at the future, do you see an end to global supply chains and moving more towards regional supply chains?
I don't know. My view is it's going to be very hard to get rid of the global supply chain order. Now, are you going to sit and train? You saw it with the first, when China joins the WTO and that trade expansion. And people said, maybe we lost all these jobs to China, maybe we can kind of get them back, but no, you can't retrain workers, and you can't you can't change manufacturing and service sectors in certain ways that economic forces don't want you to, right? Economic forces are very powerful. So I think at the end of the day, politically, the nationalism does well in domestic politics, right? But at some point, I think politicians also realize that the economic forces are quite strong, that there are some things that we just can't fight the tide again. So I don't know. This is I'm in hypothesis ground here. So
I don't mean this to be a weaselly answer, but I think to some extent we're talking about the balance between regional, but meaning multinational regional, right, and global, which we are already, right? And so I think the balance will tilt towards more multinational regional and away from global, but I don't think we'll ever abandon it. So I think it's just a question of proportions.
First of all, thank you all. I believe this has been a very thoughtful discussion, and I'm very happy to share the forum with my colleagues from GPS. I'm very proud of you guys, and I believe that supply chains, for example, from Mexico, and I believe we were over-optimistic about the meaning of supply chains from Mexico and the meaning of Mexico becoming a manufacturing powerhouse. I believe we have to do more services in Mexico, and we don't gain much out of producing manufacturers in Mexico because there's very few Mexican products in there. We only employ about 23% of the workforce in manufacturers. It's very different in the northern region of Mexico, which is about 50%, like in Baja California. So it's this is I will leave a good time to rethink things, and I believe that we'll see a balance. It will be very hard for the world not to continue to have the enormous supply chains that we have and the efficiency that have caused in the world. But we'll see. I mean, it's I will say now the center of gravitas and change is Washington, and so it is. I mean, this is. I mean, we have to keep repeating that to ourselves. This is a self-inflicted trouble, and so it really depends on the politics and in Washington. So it is fascinating what we're observing, and again, I'm optimistic in the long run, in the medium run, but I mean the next 3 years are going to be extraordinary. Thank you.
So I'd just like to thank you, our speakers. Wonderful conversation, very thoughtful. And I also like to conclude today's discussion. I think as a supply chain profession, as many of you mentioned before, supply chain is a living system. So living system probably by itself already, pretty telling in terms of constant changing, uncertainties. I think it's nice for us. Our desire is to have stable supply chain. But I think now it's really coming back to reality. Reality is the reason that all of us still have this profession, as a job. I mean, it's because, right, the system is unstable and it has a lot of risk and it needs all of us. So I do feel like, when COVID time, supply chain, I remember in the news was supply shock. I think now, because given all the tariff situation, news headline, we're in the shock again. I don't know how many times the shock needs to remind us that, yes, there's a lot more risk out there. We needed to balance, in terms of what we do. But the good news is, right, supply chain by nature is global. And the speakers here representing different options we can actually think. So I think it's optimistic. I think the winner is going to prevail throughout the time. Whoever is going to redesign, transformation their supply chain, to stand last and hopefully more stable throughout the time. So thank you again for everyone's contribution today. Wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Besides tuning in, how else can we help support Oceanside Perspective, and how else can our audience give us more encouragement?
If you like our content, we love to produce more for you. But I would say maybe 3 things. The first thing is really subscribe. If you're on YouTube, please subscribe. And if you're on LinkedIn, please follow us. We are very active on all the social media platforms. So please become our community. I think join us, that's the big thing. Secondly is, if you love us, I'm sure the people surrounded you would like us as well. So please share, please tell more people about what we do, the mission we're trying to achieve across generation again, so everybody is included. This is a very inclusive community. So please share and tell other people about Oceanside Perspective. The third thing, I think, come back to resources. I would really appreciate if you would consider that to donate to our cause for a great mission and for more content that we're going to create and benefit our community.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us today, Helen, and for talking to all of our Oceanside Perspective community.